Welcome everybody to the 2014 primary election special. Sonny Hersh is our official producer. I want to thank Keith McDonald, who's helping us in the studio. We are live right now on CANTV. My usual co-host is Jim Nally, who is going to the Bears game, and it's in New England, so he can't be here. But I am pleased and privileged to have two really great guests. One person who I'm meeting for the very first time today is the State House Chief for Illinois Public Radio, Amanda Vinicky, and also known as Amanda Vinicky Journalist on Facebook. Yes. And of course, the other person, and last time my other co-host was Bernie Stone, but the person who co-hosted with Bernie Stone, and of course a frequent guest on the show, and someone who, despite massive opposition this time around, was endorsed in Jewish Chicago. He's not running against anybody. Commissioner Larry Suffredin.
Hi there, Robbie.
Hi, and Jewish Chicago is available on newsstands everywhere throughout the nation and the world, free, throughout the universe maybe. Well, actually from about the South Loop into Lake County and out to the western suburbs near whatever. So pick it up, it's free, it's all over the place. And if you can't find it at the newsstand, go to www.aviworld.com where you can find the entire thing online. And we are getting record numbers of hits on the web, so thank you so much for doing this. Now, the election early voting is underway. The election is a week from Tuesday. We're doing this live. For those of you who are watching this on Thursday and Friday in Chicago, we are repeating this in half-hour segments, so the regular program viewers also have a chance to see this. So I guess let's start with the governor's race, because that's definitely the most interesting race that there is. So take a stab.
Well, let's see. I mean, it is fascinating, and one of the tough things for me as a journalist has been to cover the issues, number one, because the candidates themselves don't like to talk about the issues, so it's trying to break through, but also because there really is just so much interesting from a political science perspective about what's going on with this race. So trying to break out of the personalities, all of the money, the negative ads, and getting to the heart of things, when really the negative ads, that's what people vote on. But there are so many tremendous issues that are facing the state of Illinois that you got to try and get to the heart of some of those. And like I said, it's really been frustrating because we're not getting a whole ton of answers from either Pat Quinn or Bruce Rauner about what they would actually do. Part of that's probably because none of it's going to be happy news for people. You got to look at Illinois and where the budget is at, the pension situation still. There are no easy answers, and voters don't like that.
No, not only are there not easy answers, but I have found so often, having followed this, I mean, I used to sneak out of synagogue when I was 12 years old during the rabbi's speech. The 7th Ward Democratic headquarters and the Republican headquarters, we had a Republican alderman who became a Democratic judge, was across the street. And I used to hang out with the aldermen and committeemen during the rabbi's speech, and I was learning about politics. So I've been a junkie early on. If you really follow these promises, and I'm old enough to remember when there were 4 newspapers, and I actually wrote for the Fifth, the Daily Defender, for a while. I was the token white guy there, yeah. So in any event, the fact is that these people, generally speaking, rarely keep their promises anyway. And if you take a look at campaigns and campaign managers, and I've been on that side too, and I know a lot of campaign managers who will tell me honestly off the cuff, look, we're for this, but we got to present it this way because we want money from X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. So we got to go pushing this. So, you know, it's almost you can almost logically figure out after enough experience what's going to happen. It's like if you're Rauner, you know you've got to cut. You're going to try to cut spending as much as possible. The question is it still going to be a veto-proof majority? And the answer is probably. You know, in the Senate and the House, so there's a limit to what he can do. But he'll try to cut whatever he can, try to see how much pressure he can put on during those 2 years. And Quinn, in the meantime, who's an honest guy, a nice guy. I don't think he's particularly competent, unfortunately. That's a big problem. You know, he's going to try to do. Listen, he already lost to Madigan big time. Madigan already showed him, like, you know, like, I'm the boss, forget it. So he's going to be very limited in what he can do. But you know, it's important to a lot of Democrats, obviously, to keep the Democrat in there. But you know, from my standpoint, you know, you mentioned the commercials, and that is such a key.
It is.
I will not watch the news on television. I absolutely make it a rule not to, because I mean, just the regular news.
It's going to
because
cloud your judgment with all sorts of nasty stuff. You know, I just was actually in Springfield the other day and met a 12-year-old kid who, it was so interesting. I think he was 12. I don't know, about that age. And I kind of was joking with him. And so, who are you going to vote for governor? And his takeaway, the first thing he said was, well, it's got to be Quinby, because that Rauner's a really mean guy. The TV told me that he wanted to hurt a woman and hurt her family. This 11-year-old kid, that's all from a commercial based on an article that appeared in the Sun-Times. I'm sure we'll get to that later because it's been kind of a controversial point in this race. But that's the takeaway from an 11-year-old who you got to figure isn't paying all that close of attention, but it stuck with him.
Yeah. Well, Avi, remember, you've already endorsed Rauner in Jewish Chicago.
Guilty.
Yeah. So what we have, though, in this race is a contrast, and that's what makes a good election, when the two candidates are really the opposites of each other, because people are looking to make decisions.
Agreed.
And I think that the TV ads, and you know, I hear rating points being discussed, and they're astronomical rating points, which is the reason we see the repetition of all of these ads, and those are just the candidates buying ads. We have all these outside interests that are also buying ads and trying to define people. I think that what this race is going to come down to is, what do people believe Illinois should be, and how do they view themselves as citizens of our state? And I guess I come down a little bit different. I think that the maps will decide most of these cases, and they're the maps that are drawn in redistricting. But Illinois isn't going to be redistricted. Right. The state is the state, and we are the most Democratic state in the Midwest.
Correct.
Pat Quinn 4 years ago didn't carry but one major county, Cook County, lost all of the other counties throughout the state. And
he won 4.
Well, he won 4, but
barely.
Barely, yeah. But the race is really here in northeast Illinois, and it's the collar counties and Cook County. And I think at this point it's going to be very, very close. I mean, it may be a dead heat, but I ultimately believe the map wins out. And while the Rauner people are hoping to get a much bigger percentage in the city of Chicago or in suburban Cook, I don't know that you can overcome where people view themselves as Democrats. Now, will the Democrats show up? That's the issue Pat Quinn's got to face. There's a lot of effort going in. We're seeing a lot more early voting. We saw a lot more mail-in requests for ballots. But I think that ultimately what this is going to come down to is the map. And the state of Illinois is a Democratic state, and that Quinn will eke it out. Now, the other interesting thing about Democrats in Illinois is they like to split their tickets. And that's why Judy Bartopinka and Dan Rutherford have been in office. And I think we're going to see on the other statewide races some real horse trading going on, and people will come out with a balanced ticket.
I think you're right. I mean, Illinois is a Democratic state. That's not changing. And you look at this race and how much money Bruce Rauner has pumped into it. And a lot of people are bothered by that. Oh, is he trying to buy the election? Look at how much money. That said, you can imagine any other candidate that didn't have that sort of money, that didn't have that sort of draw with other big money donors, trying to go up against a Democrat who is an incumbent and has all of the advantages of incumbency, which you see Quinn use full throttle. I mean, he is all over the state on the taxpayer's dime with ribbon cuttings time and time again. There was one study, I forget what it was, like 10 times more than in the same period last year. He's milking it for all it's worth there. And again, just as a Democrat, he's already at an advantage. So if you didn't have Rauner with this money, imagine where the race would be. It'd be a blowout, despite the fact that you have, really, Rauner is sweeping when you come to newspaper endorsements. It's not just you, Javi. I mean, it is across the board. I believe the Southern Illinoisan has not yet come out with an endorsement. That'll be the 29th of October. Other than that, everything from the Decatur paper to the Bloomington Panagraph, the State Journal Register, the Chicago Tribune, the Sun-Times. Again, we'll get more to that later and what all went on with it. But
actually,
Rauner has the support.
Yeah, no, you're right. And maybe we should discuss that a little now because we brought it up a couple times and it is a factor in the race. So, you know, Dave McKinney of the Sun-Times, wife is involved in the Quinn campaign.
No, I don't think she is. No, not at all.
No, I'm sorry.
No.
You know
Democratic strategist.
I'm sorry, Democratic strategist.
And has worked for Democrats in the past, but nothing with Quinn. Yeah.
Well, I've never met Dave McKinney. I've been reading it for years, and I love his stuff. And see, you're in a unique position, you know, being the State House chief in Springfield,
Yeah.
you know, seeing his reporting and seeing what's there up front. And, you know, we bring up the point of newspapers. And I did watch you this week on Chicago Week in Review, and there were some interesting points brought up, particularly by Mike Mulligan in that particular segment. And he talked about, I mean, the days of Rupert Murdoch is what got me to subscribe to the Tribune. I just will not support Rupert
He got Mike
Murdoch.
Royko to go over there too because
Yeah,
he,
that's
needed,
what also got-
he needed a newspaper to wrap his fish in. That's what he said.
And you know what? Royko had the most interesting negative comments about the Tribune all those years when he was a Daily News columnist and then with the Sun-Times. One of the things people don't realize is newspapers aren't always fair either. And, you know, I'll give you some examples that I've seen firsthand. And well, Larry, I'm closer to Larry's age than your age, so you may not know all this stuff. But when I was in college, Bill Gaines, who was the head of the University of Illinois, where I think you graduated from,
correct.
was my investigative journalism teacher at Columbia College.
I had a class with him as well once upon a time. Yep.
And I loved the guy. And we got to be pretty friendly, and I used to go to his office at the Tribune and all that. So Jack Mabley, who was a columnist in the old Chicago American and Today, and I think before that, the Daily News or Sun-Times.
I was a Chicago American newspaper kid, and we had a ride with our bikes with a sign on it that said, "Mabley switched, and so should you." So when he left the Daily News to go to the American.
Yeah, Mabley was their lead columnist and one of the most important columnists in the city. He wrote that everybody in Springfield knew about Paul Powell long before he died. And Paul Powell, for those of you who don't know, was the Secretary of State, was found with $800,000 in the shoebox in his hotel room after he died. So I had class with Bill Gaines that day. And I asked that question to Bill Gaines, the investigative reporter for the Tribune. And I said, if that's the case, how come nobody ever revealed it? So Mr. Gaines told me, next week we've got George Bliss, two-time Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist from the Tribune coming, ask him that question. So the next week, George Bliss was there. I asked him the question. He looked like I slugged him with a sledgehammer. He couldn't believe it. And he told our class, and he's long gone, so I don't know if he wanted me to say it on the air, but this is like, you know, quite a while ago. The fact is that he had all the stuff on Paul Powell while he was still in office. He had everything documented, ready to go. He went to the editors of the Chicago Tribune, presented the story. There happens to be a place called McCormick Place, which is named after, you know, the Tribune people, which was, you know, the McCormicks. And the Tribune people said, we are so grateful to Paul Powell for getting that on the lakefront.
That they wouldn't disparage him in the paper.
Exactly. And by the same token, to switch sides to the other, to a different paper, I remember when Parky Cullerton was the assessor of Cook County. Well, he himself, that's also related to this Cullerton and all the rest of it, a whole big political family. He had to resign when 18 people on his staff were taking bribes. So there was a big headline, of course not in the Sun-Times, that the Chicago Sun-Times was getting a $400,000 tax break on their building, where now Trump Tower is, from Cullerton. So, and
well, let's get back to the newspaper endorsements. I mean,
well, let me just finish one point, and then I'm through with the subject. Okay, I went over to. I happened to run into. I don't want to say his name because we weren't talking on the record, but I happened to run into one of the Tribune's top editors, and when Ronner was first running, and I wanted his take on whether he thought Ronner was really an independent sort, you know, or going to be business as usual. And John Cass always likes to call this the combine, you know, the conglomeration of Democrats, Republicans, politicians, businessmen. I asked him if Bruce Ronner was a member of the combine. And his answer was, he doesn't think it's possible to be governor of Illinois without being a member of the combine. And I'll actually contend that the Chicago Tribune is also a member of that combine. So I think people have to look at it, you know, depends which paper you're looking at.
Well, but you know, let's look at the endorsements. Amanda's talked about how all of these newspapers throughout Illinois have endorsed Ronner.
They're not all part of the combine.
No, they're not all.
No, they're not. And we still have some locally owned newspapers downstate Though I will tell you, if you go and visit some of their newsrooms, you're
Sad.
kind of depressed because they really are in the 1960s. Lou Grant would feel more at home. But what you've got, though, is very wealthy people who've done very well in business, and Bruce Rauner is clearly one of those people, have been buying these newspapers. The Washington Post is owned by the founder of Amazon. You know, this is not a trend that's just here in Illinois. What the issue has really come out in this campaign, though, is if your friends own a newspaper and they've had a policy where they're not going to endorse, and then they change the policy to endorse, and if the publisher is the person who you, when you decided to run for governor, sold your interest to at what can be discussed as either a fair market price or a discounted price, but millions of dollars exchanged hands, you wonder about the fairness of that. And I think in the old days, you knew what the biases were. I mean, I grew up in a household where my grandfather, a World War I veteran, wouldn't allow the Tribune in the house. And the reason he wouldn't is they used to print the American flag on the front page. And he said, if Colonel McCormick needs to put a flag on the front page to prove he's patriotic, then we can't trust his newspaper. We should know that the paper is patriotic without having to always have the American flag stamped there. And he felt they were using the flag for
my
advertising.
mother told me that if she saw it on the subway, and I'll show her age now, she wouldn't pay. She said she not only would never pay the 2 cents for the Tribune, but if she saw it on the subway, she wouldn't pick it up either.
Yeah, but you know, my feeling and my experience in dealing with the editorial writers at both the Tribune and the Sun-Times is that those writers are professional journalists. But I think sometimes there are decisions that are made above their pay grade, and I think we're seeing a lot of that at the Sun-Times. I think the Sun-Times is, as it has been for the last 5 years, is continuing to be in turmoil because it doesn't have the same kind of investment structure that the Tribune and others have. But I think the real issue here is the Sun-Times, if they were going to endorse, they should have done more than just governor. Just surprises one day saying they've changed their policy, the next day endorse for governor, and then not endorse for Attorney General, Secretary of State, the other statewide offices, or any of the other offices where we have some pretty significant.
The reporters didn't even know it was going to be happening, which, I mean, you want that firewall between editorial, or the editorial board and the newsroom, and yet it was out of nowhere. The Sun-Times editorial endorsement, of Bruce Rauner was glowing. I mean, most of the other ones have come with some caveats, hey, you got to be cautious, and yet this one was basically just like over the top, and it was a day after something that looked like an endorsement but wasn't. And they said, oh, you'll know if we endorse. Lo and behold, a couple days later, here it is. There are some questions. I think we should point out, Rauner said that he never talked at all to Michael Farrow or to any member of the board. Maybe you believe him, maybe you don't. Maybe this was something that was long set up, or you just have, who knows, this is pure prognostication. Somebody who says, hey, I don't like that my friend is being beat up in the press. This is what I'm going to do, regardless of having talked to Rauner. Maybe really nothing went on there. The campaign says that it did nothing wrong. And I kind of have to say that it is not unexpected as a journalist for a campaign to come back at you with a negative story. They're going to fight it as much as possible, tooth and nail, particularly this story, which was done by Dave McKinney, also NBC, and Carol Maureen and her producer, and had been vetted. Nonetheless, there are those who question, because of its heavy reliance on deposition, that a judge had never ruled on either way, either for being true or false. And that was what the story was based on. Dave does a lot of connect the dots reporting that have been really successful. And it was kind of turned back on him in this point in time, where you had a campaign that kind of connected the dots to his wife, who is a Democratic strategist. And they did take pains to set up a firewall. So she's not benefiting at all from the Quinn campaign for any Illinois race. There's a separate company that was set up. I would maintain that when we as journalists ask for transparency from others, there wasn't that transparency here. So whereas there was a firewall, nobody knew that it existed and nobody knew what it was. So you almost can't blame the Rauner campaign for fighting that and saying, hey, there's a separate company that is based at the same address as this Democratic strategist, the reporter's wife's company, and they're doing all of these negative ads against us through the Freedom Pack, and they didn't know that there was a firewall. So I think a lot of this could have been taken care of if oftentimes we as the media need to look at ourselves and treat ourselves with the same transparency as do others, as we expect of others. And I'll also add that I think, Dave is beyond reproach. You look at his stories, his reporting, you couldn't question who he's in the tank for. Nobody. He had plenty of anti-Quinn stories as well. That said, when he hired Patrick Collins, that was kind of maybe a death knell for his journalism career, at least at the Sun-Times or in this particular story. That was, it seems as if that was more against his paper than the Rauner campaign. Nonetheless, I think that you would be hard-pressed to be able to say you could fairly cover a campaign if you have an attorney looking into one of the candidates' actions and not the others. We've seen the Quinn campaign use that against Rauner, and that was, Patrick Collins was appointed to the Ethics Commission by Governor Quinn. He's a really expensive attorney. I mean, that kind of just set the bar higher and maybe changed the dynamic. And who knows? I expect this is not the last we'll see of Dave McKinney. He's an amazing, talented journalist. And when you get down to it, it's the sad issue is something going on with newspapers and the loss of a really, really amazingly talented journalist who has pressed stories and done an incredible job at heightening the level of discourse in Illinois politics for decades.
Well, I think Neil Steinberg has kind of responded and shown that there's still independence within the Sun-Times newsroom. Mm-hmm. But let's remember what newspapers have become. They are the source of TV ads for political campaigns because the circulation of our newspapers isn't what it once was. I can remember the first time I ran racing at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning to find out when the Tribune and the Sun-Times endorsements came out to see if I had them. I don't think candidates do that now. What happens is the story, the Carol Marin story, the Dave McKinney story, ends up being a TV commercial. The editorial endorsements of Bruce Rauner, it's a TV commercial. And the rest of us don't read the source document, the newspaper itself. We see the TV ad, and so the newspaper now is not what it used to be. In these campaigns, though, the media strategists are the ones who have really put forth the campaigns, and the two candidates for governor, I think, are very disciplined. They're both staying within the
annoyingly
parameters.
Disciplined.
Well, and especially for you who cover them, because if you ask them a question that's off point, they only answer what they want to say. But I think that this governor's race is, again, it comes down, it's the contrast of these two candidates, because they are so different that the people are going to have a choice to make. I think we ought to talk about some of the other state races, because all of our statewide candidates have.
One other point about you talked about the map earlier, and one thing I really want to compliment this guy about something. We've talked about some of those suburban races, and when I talked about this candidate, that candidate, Larry would tell me that this was drawn up, so the numbers would be like 54-46. So now when I hear numbers like that, I rate the campaign managers by how much better or worse they do. If somebody gets a 52-48 instead of a 54-46,
it's a good way to do it.
He is dead right on those numbers. He really understands that.
Well, we have a congressional race in the 10th congressional district, and it's an important race to the control of the Congress. Congressman Schneider has won the race 2 years ago. He beat former Congressman Dold. Dold lost in what is the map they're running in today. Dold won in the previous map, which was much more Republican. It had been drawn for Mark Kirk. It even had a cul-de-sac that went into Palatine just to pick up very strong Republican votes. The new map doesn't have Winnetka, doesn't have Kenilworth. It is a much different map, and the race is tight. I think that one of the interesting things to me is that one of the battlegrounds of this entire state for all the races from governor on down is Lake County. And Lake County is the vast majority of the Snyder-Dold race, and it's the race where we have a number of state reps that are in tight races, where a number of state senators are in tight races. Lake County seems to be a battleground where there is a little foothold. There is a state rep named McSweeney, who is kind of a Tea Party favorite, who's got a little foothold, and his district is a little bit of Cook, but a lot of Lake. Lake County is where the battleground, and that's where maybe we'll see how all these races turn out. But it's really difficult to beat the map.
I was going to say, I think we're talking about them as tight races, but I would be bowled over if you saw a lot of changes there, just because they're so strongly drawn to favor Democrats, the Democrats that are in those seats now. It could happen, and if it's so, that's really telling. And truth be told, would likely only be for a 2-year cycle, obviously, depending on what happens with the with the presidential race 2 years from now. But that would be a quick turnaround. We're seeing, again, Rauner putting more money into get out the vote effort and kind of some of the cleaning up where Republicans had faltered in terms of their ground game in prior years. Maybe it'll change things, but you have, in addition to just the map being drawn, people like their incumbents. People have this tendency to say, hey, vote the bums out. They don't like politicians, except for their very own, the one that you see in your neighborhood.
Very true.
Yeah. You know, when you look at the congressional races, Bill Foster is up for re-election. He won on the new map, which is a much better Democratic map. He lost under the old map where he had won once.
Yeah.
Tammy Duckworth, who's a remarkable woman,
she is.
She won 2 years ago with the new map. She lost previously under the old map. So when these maps are drawn, there are people who are looking at the demographic and the votes. The one thing I think the Rauner campaign has done, and Tim Schneider, who serves with me on the county boards, now the state party chairman of the Republican side, he's put money and energy into the Republican Party. And where there was no real opposition, there now at least is an organization of people doing things. And I know this over the weekend, there were a whole number of A1s filed with wealthy Republicans who are supporting Rauner, putting significant money into ward and township organizations throughout Northeast Illinois. And I presume that that's done to get out the vote issue. I know there's some Democrats who think it's a voter suppression plan, but I don't think we're at a point where we can identify voters so much that I know I don't want you to vote and I want you to vote. So I think that what this is a get out the vote and trying to build up their numbers.
One of my favorite lines was in an editorial or column, maybe it was Lynn Sweet who wrote it, that said this, get out the vote effort. It's a necessary one, but also a dangerous game, because let's bear in mind, this isn't a civics lesson. You don't want everybody to go out and vote. It's an election. You want the people that will vote for your guy to come to the polls.
Well, that's one, once upon a time, the ground game was the single most important thing rather than commercials. And I can tell you that the good precinct captains knew who their pluses and minuses were. And they'd actually probably brick up somebody's door if they had to keep them from voting.
Well, but now we have people living in buildings where you can't get past the doorman or the guard, or it is much harder to have precinct captains than it was when we were younger.
Well,
it's a whole change. Well, the Shackman situation, there are still people who are interested in politics, and there are still people who want to learn in these races. There are young college kids that are out there trying to do things. I know we're coming to the end of this first half hour, but I do want to get into these other statewide races and talk about the control of the General Assembly. So you tell me how you're going to.
Well, you know what? Right now, just because I didn't look to see exactly where the clock started, because this clock isn't exactly in sync with what's going on in the studio in real time on TV, I want to let everybody know that for those of you who are watching this on a Thursday or a Friday, whether it's in Chicago or Evanston or whatever, this show is live. Our guests are Amanda Vinicky of Illinois State, the chief of the Illinois State House, Illinois Public Radio, State House chief, Larry Suffredin, Commissioner, 13th District. I want to thank you guys. The following week or two, depending on the city and the station, we'll have part 2 of this. You can also go to ntnm.org, northtownnewsmagazine.org, which is the regular show, and go to the website. This will actually be on YouTube later today. So, and thanks, Sonny Hersh, for all your efforts that way. So at some magical point, we're going to cut from here, and we'll magically enter the next segment. Well, I'll make a little short statement, but let's get to those races.
Well,
top of the ballot down.
Yeah.
Wait, actually, before we get to those, maybe if we really want to go top of the ballot, if that might be a good strategy. Let's bear in mind, it's not just races. We also have 2 constitutional amendments and 3 non-binding referenda. That is, I would contend, pretty blatantly, for the most part, an effort by Democrats to turn out the vote. As we're talking about GOTV, that's a big part of it. There is one constitutional amendment that I think is outside of that. It's known as the Victims' Bill of Rights, that is basically piggyback on a previous constitutional amendment from 20 years back that supporters of this change say was toothless, and they want to get in there. You're seeing a lot of money pumped into that as well from an out-of-state guy, Marsy's Law, passed in California, who's trying to get that passed now in Illinois.